Welcome to the sixth in our series. Where is it? No. Welcome to the sixth presentation in our series honoring the life and work of Elizabeth Farrell, foundress of the Council for Exceptional Children. This evening, we have the joy of welcoming Dr. Kimberly Kode Sutton, and she will address the lasting impact of Elizabeth Farrell on special education. Dr. Sutton was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and completed her undergraduate and graduate education at Old Dominion University and her doctoral studies at Marquette University. Dr. Kode Sutton is an associate professor of education and special education coordinator and department chair at York University in York College in Pennsylvania. She teaches courses including special education processes and procedures, evidence-based instruction for working with students with emotional behavior disorders, and in assistive and augmentative technologies. The focus of our research and publication is on novice teachers, collaboration, effective teaching strategies, and assistive technologies. She reviews manuscripts for professional journals that focus on teacher education, content area teaching, and youth mental health. Dr. Kode Sutton's research on the life and work of Elizabeth Farrell is unparalleled. We extend heartfelt gratitude to her for her many years of work on first and second edition of her book, and all the hard hours she has spent combing through historical documents, conducting interviews with family members, and learning all she could about a rather unknown woman who actually changed our world. We celebrate the publication of her work, and the publication by the Council for Exceptional Children. Currently, Elizabeth Farrell and the History of Special Education is in its second edition and published in 2017. We extend a warm welcome to you, Dr. Kimberly Kode Sutton, and heartfelt thanks for sharing your time with us this evening. And I will share my screen, and Dr. Sutton will take over here at this point.
Okay, thank you so much. That was a wonderful introduction.
Thank you.
I feel exhausted. I did a lot of stuff there. Thank you everybody for joining me tonight. I'm always excited to have another opportunity to talk about Elizabeth Farrell. She has had a gigantic influence on my life, on my work, even on my personal life. I was sharing a little bit of a story about that before we started. So tonight I want to talk about the lasting impact on special ed that comes from her work in the ungraded classrooms in New York City. Because unless you're familiar with the history and the development of those classes, you may not realize that some of the things that we still think about today, that we still do today, really had their roots back in that period of time with her in the very early 1900s. So before we get started, I want to do a little bit of a disclaimer because throughout the presentation, there are I have some direct quotes from Farrell and from some other individuals of her period where the language used is very different than what we are used to using today. It is certainly not in the vein of political correctness or first person or any of the things that we think about in terms of how we speak regarding young people with disabilities today. However, the language that they used at the time was considered to be, scientifically correct and politically correct, even though we've left it far behind. So you're going to hear the words ungraded or ungraded classrooms, children being referred to as atypical or defective or mentally defective or feeble-minded or retarded. All of that is going to come up. I will say one thing about the use of the word retarded in the context of Elizabeth Farrell's time. And At that point, it was not used in regards to an individual's mental capacity. They used it to discuss how many years behind in grade the student was. So if they were in the age where they should be in fourth grade, but they were only in second grade, they referred to that student as being 2 years retarded or 2 years retarded in grade. So the context of that has actually shifted a little bit over time, and hopefully that's a word we can get rid of entirely as we move forward. So starting a little bit with who was Elizabeth Farrell. When I was at the point of trying to figure out what I wanted to do regarding my doctoral dissertation, I was doing some research just on people, kind of on the history of special ed in general. And I realized two things. The first is that I realized that there were not a lot of women's names who came to the forefront. And the second is I could find these little tentacles of information, these little teeny bits of information where Elizabeth Farrell would be mentioned in the context of a focus on someone else. But it was very difficult to figure out who she was, and I had never heard of her before. So before we start talking about her lasting impact, I wanted to talk a little bit about who she was and kind of where her roots are from, because it's kind of relevant to her journey. So the picture that's there, I actually got from the family that I became close to while researching Farrell's life. When you do this kind of work and it's historical, you spend a lot of time talking to archivists, and you spend a lot of time talking to volunteers at historical libraries, and asking people to dig into things and research things for you because you're not necessarily right there. And one of the volunteer historical librarians in Utica, New York, literally sat down one day and went through, this is back when we still have phone books, went through the phone book and called every single Farrell that was listed in Utica until he finally found one that knew who Elizabeth Farrell was and was related to her. So God bless that gentleman for doing that. He's the one that eventually kind of put me in contact with the family, with John Farrell Jr. So you can see my notes underneath that picture. So this picture comes from John Farrell Jr. He was Elizabeth, or Lizzie, they referred to her as. He was Lizzie's great nephew. She is in that picture holding Mary. Mary was her niece, and Mary was David's daughter. So you'll see that family tree come next. So this is a little snapshot of kind of the Farrell family before we get too far down, but the Farrell family was a family from, the father was from Ireland, the mother was from Wales, Mary was from Wales, and it's believed that they met through their joint work in the knitting mill industry. Both of them, when you go back through census documents, have different knitting mill industry jobs associated with them. So they were woolers and carders, and over time, Michael Farrell kind of moved up the managerial kinds of ranks. They had George and David. So the little girl that you saw in the picture was David's daughter, Mary. And then Elizabeth was the oldest of the girls. And then behind Elizabeth, they had 3 more daughters. Now, researching the family tree, I will say, was a little complicated because out of the 4 members, out of the 6 members, there were only 2 of them that actually got married, and one of them was one of the sisters. So that family tree kind of became really difficult to follow quickly because she changed her name, and then it kind of, went off in all these directions that I couldn't follow. But John Farrell, the family member that I met, David was, I think if I have this right, David was his grandfather kind of thing, or great grandfather. Elizabeth was right in the middle. She had a little bit of a different experience than the brothers. Both of the brothers joined the knitting mill industry, but the family was unusual because Michael and Mary had both come over to New York when they were, Mary was actually very young. She was a child and Michael was a teenager. But over time, they actually were able to make and save a good amount of money. So the family growing up, the children growing up, had a little bit of a different experience than many of the first generation immigrants of that time period. So this is one of the knitting mills where Michael Farrell worked for a period of time. What happened as he kind of moved through his career when the children were little is he kind of hopped around through the area as he went from knitting mill to knitting mill as his positions became improved and he got higher and higher salaries. So he kind of moved around. There's a whole bunch of the little knitting mills in the little tiny towns that he was associated with over time, including one of them that he and the oldest son, George, actually developed together. So for a period of time, there was a Michael Farrell and Sons, although there was only one son involved, knitting mill. And then that disbanded at a certain point because George moved on to do something else and Michael ended up going on to a completely different knitting mill. But the family with the knitting mill industry, that's really how they kind of made their money. So actually, next slide, Paula, if you don't mind. Thank you. So ultimately, the family settled in kind of the Utica area. So they kind of hopped around a little bit as the father, as Michael, secured different employment at different mills. But ultimately, the bulk of their time was spent in Utica, which is kind of right there in the middle of this state. And the family, because they had money, were able to provide some experiences for the girls that were a little bit unusual at that time. So the next slide shows a little bit of that experience for Elizabeth. So Elizabeth was sent first when she was a child to Utica Catholic Academy. So she had this school experience. At the time, I believe it was only girls that she was there with. But she had this kind of foundational school experience. And then she went to college, which at this time, again, kind of unusual. But the Farrell girls all went to college based on what I was able to kind of discern from the readings based on about the family as I did my research. So she went to Oswego Normal and Training School, which is now SUNY Oswego, and she graduated in 1895. So the next slide is a little bit about kind of what she did afterwards. So she finished and graduated and then became a teacher of teachers herself for a period of time. She went back to Utica and taught in teacher training, essentially, at the Blandina Street Training School. And she was there about 2 years. And then she moved to Oneida Castle, New York, which is a little tiny dinky town, not too far from Utica. I think at the time of this period for Elizabeth in 1897, it was like population 291 total. So she taught for about a year in a one-room schoolhouse. So I was never able to find information about why she left teacher training or what compelled her to teach in a one-room schoolhouse, but that experience in both of them proved really quite pivotal for the way her life developed later. That philosophy of just how you're practical in a one-room schoolhouse experience when you're dealing with children at all different levels, from the very young to the older kids, and having to balance all of that was really, really kind of pivotal to how she kind of pictured these ungraded classes functioning. And then, of course, having that little bit of experience for those 2 years in teacher training also really helped her understand the needs of teachers and to advocate for her teachers. And she, as her career developed, went into teacher training herself. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we go through. So after about 2 years of the experience in teacher training and the 1 year at the one-room schoolhouse, she accepted a position at public school number 1 in New York, which was the Henry Street School. And she arrived in New York in 1899. So there, if you'll notice, there is a little bit of a time gap there that I can't quite account for. So I am not exactly sure if she just was home for a period of time or if the historical document is not quite right on the timing, but there's a little bit of a gap in the time. So she moved to, no, Paula, you're fine. She moved to New York and she had taken this new position. And what was going on in New York at that time was really interesting. New York City was going through a giant period of change. That's the next slide. Thank you. So what happened right at that same time was the city of New York was completely restructured, and all of the 5 boroughs were brought under one big umbrella to create the city of New York. So that impacted government, it impacted services that were provided, and it impacted public education. The second is the state of New York passed compulsory attendance laws that were different than what children had previously experienced. And the result of that is many more children were being told they had to attend school. You know, of course, at this period of time, we saw a lot of child labor, a lot of children that were not attending school at all. And now the expectation was that for periods of time at specific ages, children had to be present in school. And the third big impact of New York City at that time was we were seeing really large populations of immigrants moving into New York as they came in through Ellis Island, for instance, and then some of them staying because they ran out of funds or opportunity, and others that kind of just passed through the city as they went to someplace else. Now, Elizabeth's family, her parents, came through Ellis Island as well, and they were really kind of a product of like the very early stages of the potato famine. So she had kind of a family understanding of the impacts of all of that. Paul, if you don't mind moving to the next one. This is kind of the why, right? So the question, probably the biggest question that I wish I had a better answer for is, why did she move to New York City? Because, this was a girl who had a lot of opportunity where she was in Utica. She had a family with financial means that was very different at the time. She was a young lady with a lot of opportunity, which was also different at the time. And she kind of turned her back on all of it, walked away from all of it, and moved to New York City at this time of really massive change. And I don't have a good answer. She actually, in all of the writings that I could find, she never really talked about it, but I did, over the period of my research, kind of come across some ideas as to why. And they really both tie to the influence of the progressive movement. So one of them is a theory called status theory or Hofstadter theory that talks about women of her time period really kind of desiring a more important role in society than what would be allotted for them if they stayed close to family, where they would be expected to marry fairly early and may or may not be able to stay employed, like Elizabeth was. The next slide addresses, there's one more there, Paula. Go backwards, one more.
Sorry.
No, there you go. Okay, one more past that one. There we go. Yep. Thank you. We're doing this old school because I'm having technology problems on my ends of things. So pardon all the jumping around I'm doing here. So the other piece was really just, it spoke really directly about progressivism, which was really kind of kicking off in the early 1900s. And Lincoln McCormick published a book in 1983 that talked in great detail about progressivism. And they talked about three main reasons that they identified why some people really got absorbed in the movement. One of them that they identified was that there were certain middle and upper class men and women who really sought to improve urban life for those people that lived an urban existence. The second was the drive of trained professionals, of which Elizabeth was, of course, one, to use the skill sets that they had to make life better. And the third, which is really a kind of a dark one, was the desire of many folks who were native born to use social institutions as they existed and use legal means to restrict and direct these unruly masses as they were coming into the urban areas like New York City. So The writings and everything that I found about Elizabeth really never spoke to that third idea about why she would be interested in the progressive movement. And based on everything that I know about her, my instinct is to defer to the ideas number 1 and 2, quite frankly. So that's what I prefer to believe, although I've never really seen writing about it either way. She's never spoken ever about why she left it all behind. All right, so when she moved to New York, she actually moved to a very specific part of New York. She moved to the Lower East Side of Manhattan. So the Lower East Side of Manhattan is where public school number 1, the Henry Street School, was located. It was also probably one of the most dense, crowded areas of New York. In 1893, which would have been a couple years prior to her arrival, there were 1.5 million people in an area that was really just a bunch of square blocks. It was not a large area at all. And the next picture actually illustrates, what she might have experienced coming into the city, which, if you think about what I've already told you related to her background and her growing up experiences, she was leading kind of a rural, I don't know if we call it suburban kind of life, but it was definitely not this. So I think back about this and I think, wow, what must a culture shock that might have been for her to go from her experiences in a one-room schoolhouse in these tiny rural cities like Oneida Castle, and then the next year you are headed into some of the biggest and most unfortunate slums in New York City. So what did education in New York City look like at that time? So we've talked a little bit about the immigrant influence. We've talked about compulsory attendance. The fact is that the schools were not equipped to handle the number of students that were now kind of forced to flood in. Most schools were just completely overwhelmed, and just for sheer logistics, they had to work out arrangements where students attended only part-time. They just physically did not have the space. So students would be rotating in and out during the day, almost like in shifts. The second one was that there was just an overwhelming amount of student need. Teachers were dealing with issues related to their students and seeing things that had never been covered in their teacher training. There were a lot of students that spoke very little English or no English at all because they had just arrived from another country. They saw students that had mental problems, that had physical problems, and then they saw students that their attendance, regardless of compulsory attendance laws, their attendance was very erratic. They would show up when they got in trouble with the truant officer, and then they would be back out the door again. So teachers were, actually, this is the next slide. It's just a summary statement there. Teachers were really just struggling to kind of cope with everything that they were seeing. And the schools themselves were just not designed for the learners that were walking in the doors. And it was just there were a lot of things going on at the same time. And one also has to wonder a little bit whether Elizabeth knew that when she signed on to take this position at the Henry Street School, given her background, or was she naive? I don't know. So this is a little piece that I came across while I was doing my research about the structure of the schools in New York City at that time, which is that schools aim to do little, if anything, beyond crowding the memory of the child with a certain number of cut and dried facts. The typical New York City primary school is nevertheless a hard, unsympathetic, mechanical drudgery school, a school in which the light of science has not yet entered. Its characteristic features lie in the severity of discipline, a discipline of enforced silence, immobility, and mental passivity. So if you think about that in light of what we just talked about the kinds of students that were showing up for school, you have to realize really quickly that there was no way that was going to work. There's no way those children that are struggling in so many ways are going to be successful if school looks like this. So So Elizabeth got started in 1899 in the Henry Street School, public school #1. And she realized really quickly that everything that she had been trained to do really wasn't going to work well. So she got permission from her first principal, whose name was William Ettinger, and her first superintendent, William Maxwell, to basically run an experiment. She wanted to start hand selecting students to attend a different kind of class. So her first class, that first ungraded class, really grew out of the conditions in that neighborhood in the Lower East Side near the Henry Street School. So she was looking at specifically boys between the ages of 8 and 16, which is a pretty significant age range, but not only boys. Some of them were considered incorrigible, and they were unwilling to follow school rules. Others were frequently truant. Some of them could neither read nor count. Others were several years retarded in their grades. So you see the use of that term there. And many of them had health problems that interfered with their school attendance and their ability to learn. So even if they wanted to come to school and they wanted to do well, they had other issues that were proving to be barriers. And what Farrell said later was that school, as they found it, which makes sense based on what we know about the structure of school at the time, it just had little or nothing for those boys. So she got permission to kind of think outside the box a little bit and come up with a different kind of class to see if it would work. So here's what she had to say about it later in 1925. She talked about it and she said, the most difficult boys in that organization, as happens in other organizations, were the boys who came to the surface, the boys who came to the top. And by the top, I don't mean the top where everything is perfect. I mean the very pinnacle of disapproval. These particular boys, and I'm speaking only of boys now, were of the kind that were judged in terms of the moral law by teachers, and they were said to be bad. These particular boys had set themselves against what society had organized for their welfare, the educational system. Their attitude was that no self-respecting boy goes to school oftener than he has to. They had to go occasionally because there was the truant officer on the trail, but to go more was something that could not be tolerated at all. So those were really the boys that she was targeting. So the next slide also kind of talks a little bit about her philosophy, kind of what she was holding in her head as she was thinking about this experiment. So she talked about how she wanted to move away from the mass production model, which was really the model of New York City schools at the time, and basically schools across the country at the time. And she maintained that she wanted to design an education that should be based on providing the child the right kind of education, which was the kind of training that he needs and therefore which he accepts. She, although she had been trained in theory, when asked about the theory that she kind of relied on to do this and kind of modeled her experiment after, she really talked about the fact that there was really no prescribed theory that she was following. She was kind of completely redesigning the curricular model, focusing on being individualized and being very pragmatic. So I believe it was the same exact manuscript where she was talking about the class. So the first thing was to create a situation in the school that was unlike the school as anything could be. It was to reproduce in that room the experiment that the children wanted when they refused to come to school. It was full of things to do, of interesting activities to pursue, full of constructive activity. Instead of books, they had tin cans. Instead of spellers, they had picture puzzles to solve. Instead of penmanship lessons, they had watercolor paints and brushes. Instead of arithmetic and multiplication tables, they had wood and tools and things with which to build and to make. The result was that it was impossible to have these boys leave school. They were there early and they stayed late. The minute they became self-active agents in that school environment, the minute they were active people, the very minute school to them had an attraction. So she was really trying to change, really what school looked like for them and appeal to all of the things that they found interesting out on the streets when they were not coming to school, and capitalize on all that and tie it to curriculum in ways that are very practical, but also meaningful and completely away from the mass production model. So I wanted to talk for a minute about Lillian Wald, because in some of the work that I've seen done about Farrell, there has been kind of a presumption that because Elizabeth left Utica and came to New York and was teaching in the Henry Street School, she was obviously involved immediately with the Henry Street settlement and Lillian Wald. And the fact of the matter is that's actually not true. I actually don't know where she was when she first got to the Lower East Side, but she was not living in the settlement, and she was not acquainted with Lillian Wald. And Lillian Wald actually talks about that in, Lillian Wald published several books herself, talking about her time in the settlement and all of the work. And in those books, she speaks about meeting Elizabeth Farrell and learning about her. But she founded the Visiting Nurses Association with Mary Brewster, and they were kind of really at the forefront of the progressive movement. So they lived together, Lillian Wald and Mary Brewster, in the Henry Street Settlement house. And that house employed a lot of other young women who did teach in the schools like Henry Street Settlement, and also lots of other visiting nurses and other young women who were employed in like the social service area, working with a lot of these immigrant families. But in one of the books, she talks about it and says, it was one of our settlement residents, a teacher in the Henry Street School, who first startled us into serious consideration of these children. In the year 1899, she brought to us from time to time reports of a colleague, Elizabeth Farrell, whose attention was fixed upon the poor things, unable to keep up with the grade. She had, our resident declared, ideas about them. We sought acquaintance with her. The teacher who thus first fixed our attention upon these defective children has long been a member of the settlement family. And if you go to the next slide, she talks about it even more. So Windows on Henry Street is actually her second book. House on Henry Street, I think, was her first. And so initially, Elizabeth did not live with the other ladies in the house in the settlement and didn't know Lillian Wald. And then what happened was they became acquainted, and then over time, Elizabeth moved into the house in the settlement and actually lived there for over 25 years. Over a period of time, Lillian and the kind of the settlement in general became very involved in Elizabeth's work in the schools. And Lillian, because she was so influential at the time, was able to kind of help promote Elizabeth's experiment regarding these ungraded classrooms, and was able sometimes to help Elizabeth secure funding in ways that were being restricted by the Board of Estimates and Apportionment through the Board of Education. So Lillian kind of helped her figure out ways to manipulate the system and work outside the box. But in terms of Lillian's philosophy, it kind of fell under that giant umbrella of the progressive movement, because Mary Brewster and Lillian both kind of felt like we're going into these families' homes and trying to address all these other issues. And so how can we look at the education of their children as a completely separate thing? It's not. It's all about how we serve the families. So for them, it was just one big picture. So in her book, Windows on Henry Street, Wald wrote that Farrell had another side, not known to many of her coworkers. Her deep understanding of poetry and the classics, Japanese prints, old furniture, rare books. She believed that interest in the art and the culture of other people adds richness to one's own life, furnishes the soil out of which springs inspiration, must be passed on to teachers and children if the aims of education are to be attained. I love that because it was probably the only quote I ever found, the only thing I ever encountered that talked about Elizabeth as a kind of a three-dimensional human being. So much of what I read was in her words or other words of other people talking about her, but it always talked about her work. And this is the one quote I could find where Lillian Wald talked about her as a person. And I just thought that was just so amazing. And it's also interesting to see the things that she's commenting on, because you can kind of also think back to Elizabeth's foundational years with her family and the fact that she had some money. So they must have had a little bit of a different lifestyle, because certainly living in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, living in the settlement, the opportunity to acquire Japanese prints and rare books may not have been afforded to her any longer. You know, she was living a very different lifestyle at that time, but obviously, you know, that's a piece of her life that she retained that was still important to her. And she kind of used it as a way to appreciate the culture of all of these immigrant families that she was working with in the settlement. Wald also noted that Farrell was actually quiet and shy, saying that Farrell never considered herself the dynamo that generated the power for her great achievement. You know, so she was very, very quite humble about all of it. And there were a couple of other little pieces that I found where it referred to Farrell having to kind of muster a bravery in order to be able to talk to specific people when she was trying to ask for money or when she was advocating for her ungraded classrooms. And it was nice to see her in a little bit of a three-dimensional light than what I was able to see through so much of the other work. So Lillian Wald really advocated alongside Elizabeth Farrell for the development of these ungraded classes. And over time, they really kind of started to explode. So in 1899, that was her first year teaching at Henry Street School. She had her one class. That was hers, that one class. And then by 1903, there were 10 of them. So people started to absorb that model. They saw the things that she was doing, and other principals in different kinds of different schools outside of the Henry Street School started experimenting as well. And then by 1906, there were 14 classes, and the school board decided it would be in their best interest to make an ungraded class department, because they felt like at this point there are more of them and there needs to be a little bit more of a supervisory capacity. We don't want other teachers kind of willy-nilly doing other things. We want to make sure that they're kind of following this ungraded class model. So in 1906, when this department was developed, she moved out of the classroom and left her position as the classroom teacher to become a supervisor of ungraded classes. So she wasn't directly teaching anymore. She was now supervising the teachers that were doing the teaching. So as the classrooms continued to grow, she encountered some things that she really had to think about. And she had to make some decisions. And the decisions, interestingly enough, that she made really still continue to impact what special ed looks like for us today. So the first decision, Paul, if you want to switch things, was about whether or not it would be wise for her to continue to expand the program. So very quickly, over the course of only 7 years, she went from 1 class to 14 classes, and there was kind of no end in sight. There was a lot of interest in more ungraded classrooms. So what happened was the Board of Estimates, which is kind of a subcommittee of the Board of Education for the city of New York, really started to get concerned about the cost of what these classrooms were going to, how it was all going to be paid for and what it was going to entail. So they hired Henry Herbert Goddard, who was the director of research at Vineland, which was an institution, to evaluate her programs. So they basically contracted with him, and he came in and he talked with some people and did some observations. And at the time, Goddard was really interested in IQ testing, and he was trying to secure different avenues in which to implement IQ testing. And he had just recently piloted a study on how to use intelligence testing to determine whether or not immigrants arriving at Ellis Island were of low intelligence. And then the conclusion that he came up with was, yes, they were. Which, of course, we think about that now and you think the IQ test was written in English and these immigrants were probably limited English or no English. So how could they possibly have scored higher? But conversation for another day. So the board anticipated, as a result of Goddard being so focused on IQ testing and the fact that Goddard was really of that institutional mindset, that he would really come down hard on Farrell's classrooms and really, like I said here, rebuke their value. What happened is that his final report, he actually concluded that the city of New York should be serving at least 15,000 students in the program, of which they were not. So he really encouraged their expansion, which was a complete 180 from what the Board of Estimates and Apportionment expected to hear from him, given everything they knew about him. So next slide, please, Paula. So ultimately, the decision that she made, therefore, was to expand the program. That seemed pretty clear cut. And now she had this whole argument that she could present to the Board of Estimates about why it needs to be bigger than it already is. And you just hired the man that proved it. So thank you very much for that. The interesting twist, though, was although Goddard really advocated their expansion because he really felt like there were lots more children, lots more students that needed to be served in the ungraded classrooms, he really felt like they should be an extension of institutional care. That students in the ungraded classrooms, it really should be just a stepping stone, that when they leave the ungraded classrooms, they go into an institution. So that's kind of not exactly what Elizabeth had in mind. So that piece, she rebutted. She really came back and questioned his credentials. She got a little nasty about it. She called him, I mean, he was very esteemed at the time, and she referred to him as a research student in psychology. And she really kind of pushed back about his philosophy versus hers. And she stressed the similarities between the ungraded classrooms and the regular ed classrooms, with her thought being that, her goal being to keep them as connected as possible. That we will be practical and individualized with the students in the ungraded classrooms, but at which point they're able to move back into the regular ed classrooms, they will. And at which point in the ungraded classrooms we can do regular ed work with them, we will, which was the exact opposite of what Goddard had in mind when he evaluated her program. So that really clarified for her what the purpose of her program was going to be. And it was not going to be a stepping stone to institutional life for her students. There we go. So that decision then also really impacted what she worked towards with the curriculum in the ungraded classrooms and what she wanted to have her teachers doing. And she talked about this, and she said, "The work which we are doing in these classes does not differ essentially from that done in other classes of the school. We take the child where we find him. If he can read in a third grade reader, all well and good. If he can't read at all, why, that is just the same. Every teacher will know what the ability of the child is and the child's burden as it is represented by the course of study he undertakes. That burden will be trimmed to his ability. It will not be the same burden for every child, but it will be burden for every child commensurate with his ability to bear." So Goddard's commentary on her programs really helped solidify how she wanted her programs to look as they move forward, how her classes were going to look. And I think you can clearly see now, like, oh, okay, we're starting to look more and more like special ed now. So we don't think about our special ed classrooms now as a precursor to institutional life. We have a continued focus on individualization. We have, a commitment to keep our IEPs and our students' instruction tied to the regular ed curriculum as much as possible. So much so, like in this area, we have to, as student teachers write annual goals, they have to document the standard behind the goal so that we can see kind of how is this connecting to a goal. So you can kind of see that strand as it moves through. So I think we're on the next one. Oh, sorry, sidebar. There are so many little sidebars when I research Elizabeth Farrell. It's hard not to talk about all of them, but I did want to throw this out. So Henry Herbert Goddard was really kind of dismayed and shocked that Elizabeth pushed back, because he expected her to agree with him. And he had such a strong focus on IQ testing that he was able to continue to work with the federal government to implement IQ testing. And all of the results that he got, even though we think about them now as terms of course you got those results, you were testing people that spoke no English, it contributed to the passing of the Immigration Reform Act of, or excuse me, Immigration Restriction Act of 1924, which really looked at the mental capacity of immigrants coming through Ellis Island into the United States. The interesting thing beyond that is not only that how he was able to kind of use IQ testing and manipulate it in such a way that he was able to try to restrict immigration, was that act stayed in place until 1965. 1965 doesn't feel like that long ago to me. And yet it took until 1965 before anybody ever kind of circled back and thought, wait a minute, we shouldn't be doing this. This is crazy. So there's a lot. The Goddard piece with Farrell it was an interesting read. The next thing that Farrell had to really make a decision about was whether or not she wanted her programs, her classes to essentially turn into separate schools. There were some people that were really advocating for a completely separate kind of system, so much so that if you were a child that was going to be sent to an ungraded class, that ungraded class would be actually in a whole separate school away from the regular ed environment. So what happened was in 1903, which was actually before she became the supervisor, she took a leave of absence. She was granted a leave of absence from the school board to go to England to investigate what they were doing, because they had actually been doing special ed a little longer than the city of New York had. They put their programs in place in 1891, and then it became part of law, covered under law in 1899, whereas Elizabeth just got there and started the first class in 1899. So there was a little bit more history there that she felt that she could draw from, and she wanted to kind of see what was happening. And England at that time had adopted the philosophy of not ungraded classes in the regular ed environment, in the regular ed school, but that if you were sent to if you needed special services, you were sent to a special school. So she wanted to investigate a little bit more about what that might look like. Next slide, Paula, please. Thank you. So what she learned was that she was not impressed. So she wrote about it later. She had to do a report to the school board right after, but that one's a little bit more technical. This quote, I kind of appreciated her language a little bit more. The special school with its separateness, emphasized in its construction, in its administration, differentiates, sets aside, classifies, and of necessity stigmatizes the pupils whom it receives. How could it be otherwise? The special school's focus was on preventing the association of the mentally defective and the so-called normal child. So she was so, kind of taken aback by what she saw, this separateness, that she made a decision there that the ungraded classrooms would continue in the neighborhood schools as they were intended originally. She had a vision of the students, so in one family, there might be one child that is assigned to a special class and one child that's assigned to a regular class. And as siblings, they should be able to walk hand in hand to school together, and they should not be separated. So that firmly kind of cemented that she was going to make sure that the special classes were available for students that needed them, but there would not be separate schools. Next slide, Paul. Thank you. So the next thing she really had to think about was as her classes got bigger and bigger and bigger, she started having concerns about whether or not they were admitting the right students. And she was really kind of trying to land upon a more consistent manner of figuring out who the students should be that were admitted to the special classes, to the ungraded classrooms. Because what she saw now was that they ended up with referrals of a high number of children who had conduct disorders, but were not mentally defective in any way. And then there was a complete absence of referrals of quiet children who kind of blended into the woodwork, which is another comment that I think is very interesting, because we see, I think, similar things sometimes. You know, I did a good amount of teaching in the category of ED, and I kind of felt that's what happened there. If you were the naughty kid that you didn't fly under the radar, then you got referred. But if you were a quiet child that maybe struggled with something that was a little bit more invisible and related to your mental health, nobody really noticed anything, and you didn't get services when you needed them. So I thought that was interesting. The other thing is that she saw some schools didn't refer anybody. So there are no students in your school that need help at all. Okay, that's interesting. So she sought to kind of find a way to make the process a little bit more objective. And that's, interestingly enough, even though she did not appreciate the separate schools in England that she saw, she actually did appreciate the procedures that they put in place. And that's what I think is detailed on the next slide. Oh, no, sorry, this is what it looks like now. Sorry, this is the now. So nope, you're good. You're good, Paula. There you go. Yep. So this is what it looked like, and she was trying to find a better way to do it. So referrals came from a variety of sources, from teachers and principals, from physicians, from the Bureau of Attendance, the Department of Physical Training, the Red Cross, the Children's Court, the Department of Health. So anybody in any of those entities could make a referral for a student to be evaluated to decide whether or not they needed special services in the special classrooms. Those recommended for placement suffered from a variety of behavioral, academic, physical, or psychological problems, and included nervous children who cried easily, were easily frightened, constantly moved, had unusual anxieties, or were epileptics, psychopathic children who did not play or played with children much younger than themselves, overconscientious children who exhibited irritability or a marked change in disposition, children with gross conduct disorders, including the truant, the incorrigible, and those who had tantrums, morally defective children who exhibited criminal tendencies, and those children whose progress in school was considered unsatisfactory or retarded. So all of those kids were kind of coming into this system from all of these outside entities making referrals. And Elizabeth was really trying to kind of figure out if there was a better mechanism to do it. You know, are all of these kids the right fit for what we do? And are all of these entities the right place for these referrals to start from? Okay, now the next slide. Thank you. So she noticed when she was in England looking at that separate school structure that although she wasn't impressed with that philosophy, she was really impressed with how they made their determinations about admitting a student to the special school or not. Everything they did was very methodical and very objective. And if the student was determined to need the services, then they were sent to those separate programs, those separate facilities away from where they would have been in their neighborhood school. But she appreciated the procedure that she saw, even though she didn't appreciate the end result. So next slide, please. So she compared what she was trying to do with the field of medicine. There was a time in the evolution of medical science when people fell into two groups, well people and sick people. The tendency in medical research to make closer classification in order that treatment may be more exact and definite. The application of a method similar to this is what the school needs. She kind of felt like all of these different kinds of kids are coming together and they're not all going to benefit from what we do. So how do we make this process more precise? So what she did was she created what she called a psychoeducational clinic. And she pulled together professionals from 4 different fields, from psychology, from social services, from medicine, and from education. And as a team, then, when they were provided with a referral about a student, the child was evaluated by all 4 of these professionals from these four different backgrounds to figure out, what is the best course of action for this student. Is this student someone that would benefit from the ungraded class, or can we address this student's issues without ever having to send them to the ungraded class? Do they need medical help? Do they have a medical condition? Do they need psychological treatment? And they don't need to be in the ungraded class. They just need mental health support. And that was kind of the umbrella that they started looking at all of the children under. So it wasn't just a referral from a teacher or a principal or the truancy officer and bam, you're an ungraded class child, which is kind of what was happening at the time. It became much more precise, much more objective, and much more, kind of tied in that multidisciplinary evaluation process that we think about now. It's not one person making a decision, it's a whole bunch of people coming together as a team trying to figure out the best approach for the student. So there you go, the multidisciplinary evaluation and the multiple sources of information. It's kind of where she landed. So she really believed she had landed upon a new way of selecting students, a much more scientific way. And she said that not all students reported were determined to be eligible for placement in the special classes. So those determined ineligible included children with IQs between 75 and 85, children with average intelligence who couldn't read, and retarded adolescents with social adjustment problems. Only about 1 of every 3 children referred was admitted to the ungraded classes. Others were sent back to the regular class with suggestions regarding food and physical welfare, and their progress was monitored. So she goes on to talk about what happens as they monitor their progress and whether or not what the timeline has to look like then for another referral to be made, which I thought, well, that's interesting because that sounds a lot about sometimes what we see. The student is referred, they don't necessarily qualify right away. And then sometimes we have that wait to fail kind of model kicking in. And then 2 years later, there's a referral done and now the student qualifies. And they were doing a little bit of that too. So the next concern she had was just trying to figure out whether or not she could find not only just enough teachers because her classrooms were exploding, but also the right kind of teacher, because so many teachers at that time were really from the institutional mindset. Goddard did a good amount of teacher training in that institutional model. And she really felt like teachers that adopted that philosophy, that was not compatible with what Farrell was trying to do in her ungraded classes. So next slide, Paula, please. So William Maxwell, who was the superintendent when this all started, talked about this. He said, the teacher is to take up this work should be peculiarly adapted to it by nature. She should have insight into child nature, affection for children, and ability for leadership. She should be resourceful and inventive, reaching and quickening the spirit of those who suffer. She should be wise and tactful, not only with children, but also with adults. For if she is to succeed, she must become friend and advisor of the family in order to get the cooperation as necessary to the best work of the child. She must be sanguine. And now I'm saying that, am I saying that right? I feel like I'm not, it's too late at night. Cheerful, optimistic, patient, and have infinite capacity for taking pains. So no small order for these teachers that she was trying to locate. So what happened was the Board of Examiners then also really tried to help. They created competitive exams that they opened to women that had at least 3 years teaching experience. They were trying to determine whether or not they could move teachers over from regular ed into the ungraded classrooms, or if these were teachers that they really had to kind of bring in from the outside, having almost completely separate styles of teacher training. They had an exam, the teacher training exam had 3 parts. There was a written part, an oral part, and a practical part. The practical part is my favorite because they had to demonstrate skills such as basketry, piano playing, drawing, and sewing, which just proves how unqualified I would be to be an ungraded class teacher at the turn of the century. I would have failed in all of those things. But if the applicant didn't have a regular license to teach at that time, they had to pass a test of physical fitness. They had to provide vaccinations, and they had to provide proof of citizenship. So no small order of the things that the teachers had to have that Elizabeth really wanted her teachers to really embrace. Next slide, Paula. So the other thing she started doing was she started doing teacher training herself again. So through New York University and Teachers College, she started teaching teachers that were interested in learning about the ungraded classrooms, about the methods that were used, and about the supervision within those programs. She, when new teachers were hired, started assigning them to mentors who were experienced ungraded class teachers and to cohort groups. So when they came in as new teachers, they had other new teachers to really kind of get through the process with, and really kind of, have that collegiality of somebody who's new just like you. She also started publishing a professional journal called Ungraded, which specifically talked about the issues and concerns that ungraded classroom teachers had related to practice and concern. And the other thing that was really important was she worked really hard to get the ungraded teachers paid more than the teachers of the regular ed classes, which was great, but it also opened up another problem for her, because she discovered that sometimes that meant regular ed teachers who were actually not very well suited for the ungraded classrooms wanted to move over because they were interested in the higher pay scale. So she had to do some training and some screening, and sometimes some removal of teachers that were not best fit. So even more importantly, for the purposes of our conversation today, was she participated in the creation of what was then called the International Council for the Education of Exceptional Children, and she served as its first president. So the rest of what I have on here is actually a little bit of a clarification, because she's actually not the founder. There was a group of students, they were her students in one of the classes she was teaching at Teachers College in the summer of 1922. And they got together as a group of teachers, and they were talking about how they could promote more collegiality and more of a way to exchange ideas. And they had been meeting about it in kind of an ongoing way. And the leader of that group, who was a student in Farrell's class, was named Henrietta Johnson. She was a supervisor of special classes, of ungraded classes from Oakland, California at the time. And she had come in to learn at the helm of Farrell. So she was kind of guiding that group. And she invited Farrell to come to one of their meetings, and very smart of the group, they knew Farrell had the highest visibility and everything else, and they unanimously elected her president. So she's the first president of the CEC, but she's kind of not really the founder. It was a group of ladies that founded it. So at the time it was founded, it was actually connected to the National Education Association. And partly that worked because Farrell was highly visible in the NEA at the time. She had been both the vice president and the president of the NEA. So it was easy for her to kind of bring it in as a little bit of a special subcommittee to the NEA. And then over time, the CEC kind of became its own separate entity. They identified very early on at that very first meetings that they had in 1922 what their aims were going to be, and they were interested in uniting everybody who was interested in the education of the special children. They wanted to emphasize the education rather than their identification, and they wanted to establish professional standards for their teachers to make sure that they were well qualified. And membership was open to anyone who was interested, and dues were $1 a year, which sounds appealing. So one of the things they had to think about was just professionalizing the ranks. That was one of Farrell's goals, is to making sure the teachers that she hired were highly qualified, and they were professionals of their own right, separate from the regular ed teachers. And the last big decision was, or the last big concern, I should say, that kind of carries through to now, is she had lots of concerns about what happened afterwards. These kids were in her ungraded class for periods of time, and she had concerns about where do they go when they leave. So she periodically would track them after they were discharged. And she really wanted to find out if being in the ungraded classrooms had any kind of long-term impact on them in ways that she could document when they left. And the short answer, which is on the next slide, is that she really concluded that it had positive impact. In 1915, she published a report that had documented the lives of 350 of the 600 students that had been discharged from her program. And for the most part, she found some pretty good outcomes. Very small percents, only 4% were institutionalized after leaving her program, and only 1% got involved in the prison system. So considering the population of students that she was working with that were getting funneled into her program, she considered that a pretty good win, although she acknowledged that there was always work to do and redesign, and she was not going to sit back on her laurels. So in 1932, they had a celebration of the 25th anniversary of the ungraded class department. So not the founding of the class, but the structure of the founding of the department. And it was a big deal. And she got accolades from the warden at Sing Sing, from Eleanor Roosevelt, from the Secretary of the Interior. I mean, she got postcards, and a lot of people talked about her, and everybody was there and celebrated. Not long after, so that party was in March, not long afterwards, she took a leave of absence because she needed treatment for a heart ailment, and she traveled to the Cleveland Clinic, and she passed away that same year in October, unexpectedly, and she was only 62 years old. So since then, and some of this was stuff that was written about her immediately upon her death. A lot people had lots of things to say. Edward Thorndike was a psychologist that she knew very well from Teachers College. I believe he spent his entire career at Teachers College. And he wrote about her after her passing that she never forgot that schools do not chiefly exist to serve some vague doctrine of education or some abstract ideal of the state, but must make life happier for actual living children in school and throughout life. She was the defender of the interests of the dull, the thwarted, the imperfect children whom she loved. The next slide, there was a resolution that was passed by the faculty of Oswego, where she had gotten her own teacher training, who said that her contributions will continue to function in the future work of teachers of special classes, which I thought, you are right, we see that. She leaves us a legacy of work well done, of wisdom directed persistently towards the solution of the difficult problems in her chosen field, of loyalty to the profession and the noble ideals which it professes. The next one is from Lillian Wald. Lillian Wald wrote about her in her second book in 1941. And she said, looking back upon the struggles to win formal recognition of the existence of these children who now so much engage the attention of educators and scientists, we realize our colleagues' devotion to them, her power to excite enthusiasm in us, and her understanding of the social implications of their existence come from a deep-lying principle that every human being, even the least lovely, merits respectful consideration of his rights and personality. And then finally, at the CEC headquarters in, well, I guess, are we in Arlington now? I know they've moved between Arlington and Alexandria. I have a hard time remembering which one it is. There has been periodically a plaque that has hung. I don't know if it's there now. When I first started doing my research way back in the day, the plaque was in a box. It was not on the wall, but there is a plaque, and this is what it says. It shows Elizabeth in profile, and it says, in memory of Elizabeth Farrell, a pioneer teacher of backward children in New York City. She devoted her life to the development of the ungraded classes and left all children in need of special help the assurance that they might find it in the public schools. So about 90 years since Elizabeth has died. So what is her legacy? The next slide, Paula, kind of just details a little bit of what we've covered. So, there were all of these decisions that she wrestled with that really still impact what we do today. The focus on individualization, the connection to regular ed, and that philosophy away from institutional life, the multidisciplinary evaluation, and gathering information from multiple sources, ongoing efforts to address teachers and teacher shortages and teacher training in this field, continued concerns about post-secondary outcomes, and there's just so much more. There are so many rabbit holes to go down when I start talking about her and all of her work. So final thoughts. This is my favorite slide of all because it's Elizabeth's words. And this is what she said. Your state didn't ask you to be a teacher. You came and offered yourself as a teacher. And I want to challenge the right of any person to be a teacher of another unless that person will exhaust every resource to be a better and better teacher. It is a race between destruction and education. I am a teacher and destruction will never win. That, out of everything I've read, forever about her and all the things she said is probably the most powerful quote I've ever found. And when I present this to practicing teachers, which I do periodically, I always end on that quote. And it's just such a powerful, amazing way to end this conversation about Elizabeth and have them think about, why do you do this and who are you? So thank you very much for joining me. I can talk about, you can probably pick that up. I could literally talk about Elizabeth Farrell forever. There are so many things to say about her. And every time I try to build a presentation that has a little bit of a theme, like lasting impacts, I dig back through all of my materials and I get lost for a really long time. So this is a presentation I started like, I don't know, 6 months ago or something when Paula reached out to me. And I literally finished it at 5 o'clock because I had to keep parsing through stuff and figuring out, oh, nope, okay, that's a rabbit hole. I got to get out of there because otherwise you'd be listening to me for hours.
So wonderful.
Thank you so much. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk about her.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. Anybody with, I know Beverly, do you want to say anything about the comments there?
Let's see. This has been a great presentation. She and Mike Gerber should get together and talk. Excellent, informative, and insightful. Yeah, just lots of positive comments. It was very, very interesting.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it.
Very interesting.
Thank you, Kimberly. It's beautiful. And any other one, Luann? Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. And the time has flown. It's 8:13. It's really so special, Kimberly, that you get so close to the person of Elizabeth Farrell, I think.
And Luann said, it's amazing how far we have come, but we also still have so far to go.
That's funny you say that. That's what I pulled out. There was a slide in there about like, what would she have to say about special ed now? And I thought, oh boy.
Yeah.
I feel like she'd have some mixed reviews.
Yeah. Joan, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Kimberly. It was a delight to listen to you this evening. I read your first edition book, and I'm going to be leading a book study on that for the Pioneers Division.
Oh, wow.
Next month. So I really appreciate all the information you shared. And just so that you know, I live in Arizona now. I'm originally from Brooklyn, New York.
Oh.
And when I interviewed for the New York, when I got my certification in 1969, 70, I think it was, August of 70. When I interviewed for the New York City public school system, it was a written exam, it was an oral exam, and it was a medical exam.
Okay.
So I had to go through so some of those pieces, they did, I did student teaching, so they didn't have a practical piece. But the bottom line is back in the late 60s, early 70s, their interview process hasn't changed that much.
Yeah, at least they got rid of the basket weaving and the sewing. They didn't make you pass a physical fitness test.
No, I just had to have a medical.
Yeah. So. It sounds a little bit better, but not quite fully improved.
Yeah.
Well, no, in the interest of time, I wish everybody a safe journey. Kimberly, I know you must drive, dear. So, and maybe we'll connect again at another time.
Any opportunity, I'd love to talk about her.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you, ladies. I appreciate it.
Good night, everybody, and thank you. Thank you so much.